Welcome everyone to the Op Show, where we bring you the trials and tribulations, the automations and collaborations from the world of DevOps and the greater developer experience. Today, I'm proud to welcome Wesley Faulkner, a developer relations and neurodiversity advocate for the likes of IBM and MongoDB. Wesley, welcome to the show. Did I miss anything?
Nope, that's good. Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Well, really excited to talk today about a lot of diversity and inclusion in tech. And, obviously it's a very pressing topic at the moment and a really important time to create change. What are some of the approaches that you've been seeing that you think will be successful or that you're looking at positively? Are there some leaders in tech that you think are taking the right steps in order to make lasting change, and it's not just kind of a greenwashing sort of approach?
Yeah, I actually had a conversation about this, that I think that Microsoft is having a really, really good approach to making sure that they have lasting change. There's a couple things that they're doing. One is that they recognize that as a company, themselves are not perfect internally. So I think this is a different approach than some other companies where they say, we want to have change in government or policing, or have a change in policy that governs the populace. But I think a lot of the focus should actually be internally about what changes that they need to make in order to support that same value system. And it can't be just, we need to listen more. I think listen more is saying that they have to work to try to find these voices or to understand the recommendation. I think in a lot of companies, people are speaking up. And I think what would work better is looking within and enabling those that are speaking to have more power. So it's not the listening is the problem. Well, I mean, it is, but it's the active muting of the voices. So what they need to do is remove those barriers, remove those obstacles to allow those voices to be heard. Also, companies that force people to sign NDAs or non-disparagement clauses, because if you don't want someone to talk bad about your company, don't do bad stuff in your company. And what it does is it has a silo effect. So let's say I have a bad experience at a company. I'm not allowed to say it. I think I'm a one-off, where there could be 200, 300 voices that have the same experience. But since we never hear of each other, we're never able to help influence that and start that conversation amongst ourselves. It reduces the amount of the impact because it feels as one-off when it could be an active, like repetitive effect of the company and how they treat their employees. So having a strong statement about values within and with some teeth behind it is pretty much the best way to approach this. I've seen companies say that they'll donate or do matching funds. That's all good too, but that is in a way putting the onus on them, saying we'll give them money for them to fix the problem. But within a company, it's their domain. And so they do have the ability to make direct impact, and they can spend some of that money instead of donating, which is good. If you can do both, that's great. But if they only have that same sum of money, look internally to figure out how they can suss out racism and racist practices in their own company. And if the immediate knee-jerk reaction is we don't have that problem, that just means that they are unaware of that problem. And if they're unaware of that problem, spend money on the research to figure out what practices you have in hiring, promotion, pay scale, how HR complaints are being handled, how they're supporting their internal employee resource groups or ERGs or affinity groups, figure out when complaints have been brought in through that system, how they've been handled. Actually do a holistic evaluation of the company and how different systemic processes could help mute or amplify negative voices, and actually do the work to fix those. And if that's going to cost money, use the money that you would donate and use it internally to hire someone to figure that out and have a clear understanding, then get recommendations, and then be very vocal about this. And this last part is important. Come up with the plan to how you're going to implement those changes.
Yeah, because it's not an easy change to make for a lot of organizations. It's since the beginning of a company and their culture, and it's hard to make these like widespread cultural changes without full buy-in, without the right, empowering the right people. It's definitely it's going to take a lot of work. When you think about connecting, you mentioned, some of these, it seems like you might be in isolation if you have a complaint or you have a suggestion, and there might be other. Do you think employee resource groups are one of the best ways to kind of connect people that are trying to enact change or actually be able to see what needs to be changed?
That is one avenue where you can give you a higher probability of finding people who might be running into similar issues so that you can feel less alone. So that is a really great group. But if the sponsorship is not all the way up, if the buy-in is not there on the executive level, there could be a problem. There are several companies that have people who are in charge of D&I or diversity and inclusion efforts inside the company that usually works closely with these groups. And if that person who helps with the transfer of information from what comes from these groups over to management and that have the power to make change, if the person in that position who is that liaison doesn't have power, then it's just another recommendation system where people can just put information to die or to not be acted on. I think in the technology space, we are used to understanding technical debt of systems that are put in place that now being revisited need to be refactored or optimized. And it's a big undertaking to be able to take the system offline or do a giant overhaul. People need to understand that needs to be done with their culture and with how they run business themselves. And being unaware is just an excuse. If you haven't done anything to actually look for the problems, and having a person who has enough power to give context and perspective, then it's hard to make change.
Yeah, it's there's a lot of awareness that needs to come out of a place that it can be very difficult to spot for, it can be hard for people to see what is going on when it's been like this for decades. And now, even if you can't, this is not like a duct tape sort of solution. Like, okay, we made an employee resource group. Now that's solved. It's got to have that buy-in from leaders and, and actually a concerted effort is what you're saying to go in and actually revamp some of these cultural aspects of the company to make sure that they are DEI or diversity, equity, inclusion, right?
And you can see a lot of reflection and just in common terms of technology of how, let's just say, if you have an application and it has a blacklist and a whitelist, mm-hmm. and how that can be offensive, and people are like, yeah, that's how it is. But the context part is telling why that's offensive, of like black being bad and white being good, and how that's pervasive. And you need so people can see that and like, yeah, I see it's a problem. It's not a huge problem. Everybody does that kind of a thing. So it's easy to shuck off that being a problem unless you have that context about how offensive it is. And the same with like master slave in terms of relationships with like nodes, for instance, how that's extremely offensive. But then they have to say, okay, then we have to change all of our documentation. Then we have to change our API. Then we have to figure out how to support legacy calls with going forward. It's a huge, huge undertaking, but that work needs to be done. And that's just from like changing words that you're using and think about it in terms of how that was okay, how that was seen as okay to be put into the product. And so all of that has to be examined in that whole pipeline. And the lack of diversity, lack of inclusion is probably how that problem started, which means that the inception of how things are deliberated was flawed. And that you have to be able to recognize that the meat of where things come from, the heart of the product could come from maybe not intentionally racist or offensive, but because of the lack of inclusion of different perspectives, how that allows that to happen in a company.
Yeah, those are some good examples, I think, to look into, like how ingrained where you just, a lot of people would just gloss over it, but it's like once you call them out, it's like, yeah, that's an obvious change that needs to be made and it'll take work. But I think that's one thing that you've been very good at in our conversations, is calling out these very specific changes that can happen. And I think a lot of companies need someone with that perspective that can just like, hey, look, like that's weird. And it'll work. Same with third-party applications too, right? Like you're a company and you want to buy a product. Do you look at that? Is that if diversity, inclusion, and making sure you're not offending your employees, how are you vetting the products that you're purchasing, right? Like if you're an enterprise company, you're like, well, we need to make sure security is there because security is very important to our business. Oh, we need to make sure that it's financially sound because we need to make sure that we don't overpay or overspend. Or the company needs to have a track record of longevity or reaction. So all of those things is considered a vetting process for bringing in third-party software. If it's so important to you as a company, you need to add these perspectives in the purchasing of the software, or even your customer base saying, oh, they have a history of supporting racism, maybe you won't take them on as a client. Or when it comes in, when you check their credit, you check their intention, you check how big a company, like their buying potential. If it's really important for diversity inclusion, that should be part of your checks too, and bringing in new clients. It's every part of the company needs to be re-examined. Yeah, I guess you've seen that, like in terms of examples of tech companies dropping clients that are, like I think I've seen calls for GitHub to back out of supporting ICE. And Amazon, I think, just were they cutting a contract with one of the police departments in the US or something like recently.
Yeah, they did a 1-year pause on their facial recognition.
Oh, right.
IBM said that they're halting all face recognition products and selling the general face recognition product, that kind of stuff. So there's several companies that are re-examining their associations with other companies, and some of their products themselves are they're being looked into. And like I think also like Ben and Jerry's, I know that's kind of random, they really like stated exactly what they want in terms of reform. So yeah, companies need to look at all their aspects of doing business and realize that it just comes down to money. Like I was saying, like instead of donating that money, realize, hey, we're going to lose some sales. So are you willing to make that sacrifice? Or we're going to have to like not use any of these products. We can't find anything that fits. And so we have to commission something to be custom built for us. There's going to be an expense, and you have to have a commitment from every single level in order to really be committed.
Yeah. I like how you set the expectations there too, because I think if you go into it, expectation setting is just one of the biggest things you could do, because now you're not going to be surprised. You know what it's going to take. You've talked to the right people, and now you can now you're empowered to be able to make the decisions and spend the money that needs to happen. So, another thing, I mean, I guess one of my thoughts too is like, and why does this matter so much in tech, and why does the conversation come to tech? Is it the audience? Is it like the access, the power of these big tech companies, the audiences? Does it matter in this industry, more than any other industry right now?
I'm going to say it matters everywhere. But the reason why there's a bigger focus on tech is because you can just look at the stock market, and it shows that a lot of smaller companies, a lot of industries, during the hardship of COVID, there's a huge decline in all of these other verticals, but tech seems to be weathering the storm. In a time where people are losing their job and the unemployment rate is skyrocketing, tech companies are the ones still hiring. So the shift of power has moved over to tech to the point where they're able to not only craft legislation because of their power and their involvement in government, because governments know that the economy is kind of going with the tech companies. If a giant tech company moves into your area, like when Amazon was looking for HQ2, you can see how governments jumped and crawled over each other just to try to get the opportunity for Amazon to move that location, because it is going to seem as a widening their tax base, enriching the surrounding businesses around these companies, and employing their residents with high-paying jobs. So tech, the balance of power is moving more towards that direction, and so goes the influence. And so if you're able to have some of the voices who are leading this charge take a stance, it makes it's more of an impactful statement, and the actions other companies will follow. Because if Amazon, Microsoft, Apple, Google, if all these companies are able to make this change and make it work and be successful, it kind of removes the excuses. And by making such a large target, saying these are the customers we're accepting, this is the type of business we're going to participate in, it is making a market to be good and to be on the right side of equality and equity. That's being a really big part of it. The other part of it is that the companies themselves, like the example that I talked about, the master slave, white list, black list, and how that was probably decided long time ago. From where we are at this point in time, there are old products, and looking at the course of innovation that usually comes from technology in the tech sector, it's important to get as much diversity in that stream, so there's less of that, I'll just call it technical debt, technical debt, or the
cultural debt,
all that stuff. It's important to factor that in now, so that as we iterate through these products and create new ones, and let's face it, these products affect everybody, and not just in this country, but all around the world. And so the more that we're able to influence that, it's going to help everyone. Some of them explicitly and some implicitly, just by the fact that there are more people in the room that helps make this decision. Like, I bet you don't know a vast majority of people who don't use a Google powered phone or an Apple powered phone. And so if you just take those two giant things that we use as people, generally speaking, all the time, and most of the people that we know use those were influenced by the people in that room. So we just want to, they should include more people to have a better impact in everybody's day-to-day life.
Yeah, I think after our first conversation, I think a lot about the product teams and development teams, and how that, who's in the room and how they're thinking about things, will eventually have such an impact. And I think you mentioned one of the examples that came up, years ago, on like tracking your period on the Apple Watch, and like some things that just kind of like go missing in technology or in technology products, that probably would have been thought about if the people in the room looked or acted or thought a little bit different. So I think that's, are there other examples that you see that, in products where, this sort of like there's been something missed?
Oh yeah, there's tons. Like, I'm sure everyone knows the Google Photos example, where they recognize people who are Black as gorillas. And so that's really offensive. And some of this stuff is life threatening. This is not in tech, but when they test safety belts or airbags, they only did it for a male at a certain height. And so when women drivers started using these new safety systems, it caused more fatalities because they weren't included in either the testing or the input. I think if there are plenty of examples of this, and some just seem very, very subtle, like getting a Band-Aid that matches my skin is a lot harder than you think it should be, right? And and you got to think of like, why haven't there been a lot of hues and color changes for people? And like even like Face ID in Asia, where they have always been wearing masks, how Face ID, but it was just added that it's able to recognize when you have a mask on and ask for your PIN. So things like that is where like having more people in the room and inclusion can work around some of these problems and make it so that it's more accessible. Because let's say the mask thing, for example, that could have been there the whole time before COVID and no one would have noticed. And then someone put on a mask and say, hey, it's nice that it does this. So being able to think about another region or another culture helps your product overall, and it keeps you from having to rapidly iterate to make these changes. One feature that I do want to praise that shows that tech companies are listening, on the Android operating system, there is on Android 10, you can turn on closed captionings for all audio. So if there's no captioning provided by a video, you can turn this on, it'll listen to the audio and then put captions on the screen for you. Which is great accessibility for people who may not have hearing loss or are totally deaf, or for someone who wants to watch a conference without waking up someone in the same room, or if you are in an airport in a loud situation and you can't hear the audio. So doing these things that help for accessibility, I don't want to say that they're only for the group that it affects. It helps everybody, and that benefit spreads. And even if you're using it or not, like the iPad, you touch it and it seems so simple, but then they discovered that making it more accessible by touching it allows for like 2-year-olds to now do computing that was enabled by making it more accessible for other people.
Yeah. I remember you were telling me about the idea of like, the harsh curbs, and then smoothing out the curbs not only allows someone in a wheelchair to go through, but it's easier with a stroller. And I like this trickle down effect of, if you're the most thoughtful, then actually everyone else is benefits as well. And it's not just like, hey, we're doing this one-off thing. It actually affects the entire ecosystem of how that product may interact with its users.
Yeah, and the one fallacy is in terms of like, most people won't use that, or like it's just a small edge case. Keep in mind that just because you feel like you are not part of you're not someone who would benefit from these solutions, that may not always be the case. I know someone who lost through carpal tunnel the use of their hand for a little bit. So one hand, they couldn't use their left hand, but they could only use their right. And being able to operate a phone one-handed was great. They had to get a one-handed keyboard. Or let's say that you become blinded, or like you get into a car wreck and you can't use your legs anymore. Just because you feel like, hey, I'm able-bodied and so this doesn't affect me, that might not always be the case. And so it's not only for people now, but it could be a future you that can benefit from these technologies. Yeah,
really good point. So when you're thinking about, bringing in those other perspectives onto your team, or, is it, I've heard a lot, make the hire, write the check, like, is it about hiring? Is it about, let's say like with the face mask example in East Asia, and most people are wearing face masks already, is it getting consultations from people, in other teams? If it's a big company, it might be people in other teams in other countries. But is it a hiring thing, or what else do you see can be made, as far as helping make these product team and development team perspectives more diverse?
So it's hiring is one, yeah, bringing people in, but retention is really big too, to make sure that when you do hire, they keep them in, and making sure that they have a voice, and they can speak up, and that voice has power.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of times when you bring, I'll just use a general term of a minority. If you bring a minority in a room, let's say there's 20 people who are all the same, and then you bring in a minority, and then the 20 people have an opinion and the 21st person has a dissenting opinion. Everyone's like, well, you're the only one who kind of has this opinion, and it can get overrode or muted or just seen as not an issue.
Mm-hmm.
And so just proportionally, the person in the room who's the minority, I'm not even going to identify who that is almost certainly going to be in a position where they have a minority position, and that in itself could feel or be interpreted as not important. Like the person in the room who are making Band-Aids saying, hey, maybe we should do in different shades. You're like, that's not really a huge customer base. We don't really worry about that. So that is important to make sure that even though that one person might be a dissenting member of the group and might seem as though they're just preventing consensus, that they're slowing the whole process down.
Mm-hmm.
Make sure that there are mechanisms in place to handle those situations. Because especially, let's say, like I said, the 20 people talk and then one person has a dissenting voice, the one person has to be able to have the feeling and the empowerment to be able to speak after knowing everyone else is on the same page. If that person who might be this dissenter was given the freedom to express their opinion first, then maybe they would be able to express it in a way, and then people could start rethinking their position as it goes around the table. But there are different ways of handling that. There may be blind voting, like everyone puts in their suggestions and then you pull them out, and then there's a conversation about the different suggestions, so they don't influence each other. There's different ways of handling that, but just hiring someone is great. A lot of companies have efforts to hire diverse populations, both neurodiversity and of different backgrounds. But you also have to look up the turnover. And I would say that if you look at the overall numbers from these diversity reports that tech companies file, they might improve by 1%, maybe 3%. But these increases need to be matched up into their actual hiring pipeline and their retention numbers. Because if you have people in that try to make a difference and they get really put down or
shut down,
it's just going to demoralize that person, and
or
they're
not supported.
Yeah, it's like I can't do this anymore. I can't fight the good fight and then told that I'm wrong. And bad systems ruin good people. So you can hire as many good people as you want, but if your system's bad, it's just gonna just hurt more people than helping your own company. Yeah,
I've seen this happen with people going into companies that have a major diversity problem, and everyone looks the same, and it's like basically it's all white males, and in a tech company with like 1,000 or 2,000 employees, and maybe there's only a few women on the entire team or something like this, and someone try to go in and change that, be the D&I advocate or leader, and try to change that, and just kind of get burnt out on it because of the lack of support. It's like, yeah, well, we just hire this person and everything gets fixed. And it's like, that's, this is not just a 1 year, or it's multi-year, like you said, full resources and commitment to actually induce that change in the way that you want it to. And it's hard. Yeah, it's hard. It's I think people oftentimes get defensive, or, afraid of the dialogue, or, there's a lot of, I guess, misunderstanding, and that's where the communication and that dialogue can be really important.
Yeah. And I think some of the traps for people who don't want to actually face and admit that these problems happen is they're like, yes, that is a problem. We'll do changes. They say that. Or yes, we'll do changes in next quarter. or they keep, and then they put it off, and they put it off, and the employee stays waiting for the payoff. They're like, when is this going to happen? They said it's going to happen. It went all the way to the top, and they say they're committed to this, and it builds up this false hope that makes you fall that much further to the ground and just really just tear you apart. So a lot of companies do that too, where if there'd be one thing, it's like, we're not going to listen to your suggestion. It's almost worse to say, oh yeah, that is really important and we're committed to that, and then nothing happens.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then, because then you start breaking the trust, and you don't believe that you can actually trust the people that you're talking to anymore. And maybe at that point, yeah, it's that once that trust is broken, I think you see it in a lot of different ways, especially in startups, and it can really, that damages the culture. So especially in startups, it's sometimes hard to recover.
And it seems a false signal to all the other employees, saying like, oh, wow, the company said they're going to do something. And they're able to perpetuate this lie internally, saying, well, the company does care about this issue. The company is going to do something about this issue. But they forget, and they don't circle back mentally. And so they're able to get all the good feelings from that statement, but none of the results actually pan out.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned it recently, the neurodiversity side of things. It's something that I think you pride yourself on, and you'd like to talk about. I'd love to go into like, what is neurodiversity, and why is it important?
Neurodiversity is a big umbrella term that encompasses a lot of things that kind of mean that people think differently, and that can express themselves in several different ways. Usually the go-to version of this is people who have who are autistic, or on an autistic spectrum, or Asperger's. You hear about that in terms of neurodiversity, but it could be a lot of different things, like dyslexia or ADHD. All of these kind of fit into the spectrum, but there's also ones that can not be necessarily what you're born with, but could become acquired, like different mental health issues like PTSD, for instance. There's traumatic brain injury, and neurodiversity can also not affect the way that you think, really, also, like Tourette's, where you might have some spasms, or maybe some tics. But in terms of the way that you think, it's closer to neurotypical than anything else. So neurodiversity is a giant umbrella term that means that, whatever you think is quote unquote normal, other people might have a different thinking process. And the reason why that's important is going back to the diversity thing I was telling you about, the people in the room, understanding how processes affect them. Have you ever had a conversation where someone says something and then the other person takes it way out of context? And this happens via text all the time. Mm-hmm. And having someone who's able to do that, to see the same thing but maybe at a slightly different angle, can find ways to mitigate problems or make things clearer, so that it affects and it helps more people. So this is kind of like pervasive in like your UI UX in your product. This could go into your marketing. This can go into your schema design to make sure that you're putting in more use cases and more flexibility for future iterations of your product. So neurodiversity can help look at some of the same things, just maybe at a different angle. Yeah,
that's really interesting to think about too. Is I often think about it in like terms of, at least in terms of the work styles aspect of it. And, when you talk about this, like diversity of opinion, that can be a big aspect. It comes back down to your brain and just like the experiences and your experiences, your memories, your perspectives on things, and how that all plays into the ways that you work, and then the ways you think, and then the ways you can contribute. And neurodiversity is a I don't know, I haven't seen it as often out there. And I think when we first talked about it, that was one of the first times I've really seen it described in that way. And like you said, it's a big umbrella term, but also like very important way to think about how the brain, how to get different types of brains, and different types of thinking all together so that you can, you might find some really interesting things. Have you found other ways or other avenues, or how, when you think about the neurodiversity side of things, what have you found, or and how to engage that, or even understand like the types of diversity you have on the team now based on people's work styles or brain patterns, or have you found some novel or interesting ways that help people recognize what sort of and how much neurodiversity they have on their team?
Well, there's I think if it's a company that encourages you to bring your whole self to the job, I think that helps. I think being able to speak out, like I keep going back to that, like being encouraged and being supported in that. I think you could, even a few years ago, people who were colorblind maybe felt like they didn't have a voice. Yeah. But then they said, hey, I really don't, sorry, but this button looks just like that button. So is there a way that we can use different colors that help more people? And then that got incorporated into UX design, for instance.
Yeah.
And so if you're able to allow people to be different, to be able to have these difference of opinions and different approaches, if there's a good way of sorting through those ideas, maybe through some value systems like speed to market, cost of implementation, incremental reach of how many people it will affect, like have some actual some standards
or
so you can say, hey, if we make this change, it won't hurt too much here, instead of, like I said, if the people in the room saying, I just don't think that's a big idea, a big enough like change to warrant like putting some work in, where people can able to say yes or no based on a gut reaction. And if you can just find a way to quantify either the work or the benefit, I think that is a way that people can feel like, hey, I have this different perspective and I know it'll move this metric. And that would be a good way of incentivizing people to do continuous improvements on a product based on their own personal experience.
Yeah. That's a good point. I think there's probably, for let's say like there you're gonna encounter, for someone who's trying to enact these changes in diversity in their team, you'll definitely encounter, let's say, the naysayers, or people that don't see the business value, or what are ways that, or like, I don't know how to track this, or maybe like there's are there other kind of frameworks or formats that you have, like say like here's like a checklist of ways that we should go through to make sure this is an equitable and accessible product or feature, or what's something that like, have you seen things out there that like any product or development team could have to make sure that they always go through this process?
Well, that's really going to depend on the structure. A couple things you can do to help bring forth this change is to have a serious conversation saying, all right, I looked at the past, right? You can't dispute the future, because you don't know what will come up. But if you bring evidence of the past and saying this was greenlit and this was not, what is the structure that allows this to happen, and make the person who approves it actually articulate that thinking. So like, oh, well, it's just that not many people are going to use that. And then you're like, oh, really? What is the statistical model and source that you use to determine that answer? And they're like, oh, well, it's just gut feeling. Then you could say, okay, so are you able to now like agree that if most people are this percentage won't use it, then it should be not used. And if this percentage does use it, it should be used. Do you agree to that? What percentage is that? And have them nail down that figure from there in that conversation. Then actually pull source and saying, here are the numbers, right? And this one that was greenlighted fell below your threshold. This one, so like, and they're like, well, it should be done. And then that brings up another thing of saying like, well, if this got greenlit, tell me why. Why is it important if it goes below this threshold and it still got done? Why is that? And then that is a process of like putting some solid black lines around these features that need to be put in, or the approval process. The other way is to, if you're an individual and you want to try to amplify your voice, is to find a buddy that has some of the same thinking, and be able to have these conversations to see, like, is it me, or does this not make sense, or are you noticing this too? So it's part of a support system for doing a sanity check. And also, if you present an idea and it gets shut down, that someone else is that other voice, which you don't feel like you're such the dissenter. This is all in a controlled situation. In open source projects, there are ways to put systems in place, like blind assessments, where you can remove like names and other things that can indicate some bias. So remove the bias from the process of looking at ideas. There are other tools in which, like group voting might be one, and some weighted opinions, where maybe if someone has a minority opinion, maybe you give them more votes, or make their votes cost more, or worth more for them when they participate, that it swings it a little bit more. Those are some tools, but it all depends on the way your workflow and the environment that you're trying to change.
Yeah. I like the voting, the anonymous voting. Have you seen like any tech tools that, do that really well, or?
No, unfortunately, no. It's all custom built.
Okay.
You could do this almost automatically if you have something like Jira. Just make some fields only accessible to the reviewer. You can, but it's all customization out of the box. This is not something that is generally available from a product that I can recommend.
Yeah.
But usually, if you can, depending on where you put the fields or how you have in submissions, you can kind of cobble something together.
Yeah, maybe a future startup idea for you. Or I feel like with all the product, the vast scope of product, the wealth of information, knowledge that you have, you'd be a great PM building something.
Thanks. But also, like I was saying about the large tech companies, if they start demanding tools like this, then that's building a market for giving space that someone can build a company based on this small niche thing that could help other companies. So this is what I was meaning, like the influence of tech. It makes a lot of space, and it helps people grow if everyone is kind of being pushed in that direction, because they have to solve these problems. And that's where real innovation really happens, when you give space for that and you make a market for that kind of product.
Yeah. Well said. Anything else on your mind? Is there anything else that, I'm also thinking about other, leaders or companies that, places that people can go to get more information on doing a lot of the things we just talked about?
I would say also keep in mind that if you're a company, you're a person in a company, you're a person who has power in a company, that you need to widen your bubble, not only in the company, but in your personal life, private life, in your social life, in your sports life, whatever you do for fun, the way that you are engaging, try to open your bubble a little bit and add some diversity in a lot of aspects in your life. In your thinking process, when you go to the grocery store, wonder what you're going to buy based on this lens of understanding you need to diversify and just expand your thinking. When you go to the bookstore, go into a different section that you wouldn't go. If you're in an airport, walk into a store that you wouldn't normally walk into. There are ways of increasing diversity that goes beyond the scope of your workplace and the people. Try to diversify your if you never watched soccer, never watched golf, you never watched frisbee golf, you never watched all sports in a different language, just exercise your thinking by expanding your bubble, especially if it's something you're doing regularly.
Yeah, I love that. That it's this kind of keeping this curiosity or this child's mind like alive and being open, being curious and not defensive, and keeping that sense of wonder in the world. That's a great way to go out. Well, thank you so much, Wesley. Appreciate your time here. Where can people find you?
Mainly on Twitter. So I'm Wesley83 on Twitter, and I pretty much engage with anyone. So if you want to say hi to me, that's good there. I'm on LinkedIn. So linkedin.com/n/Wesley83. You can find me there on LinkedIn too, if you want to look up my history or do some research on me. But I do not accept what your intentions are, and then let's start a dialogue. But definitely Twitter is my preferred platform.
All right, thank you, Wesley. And that's it for the Op Show today. We'll be back next week.